The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, the Auditor General of Ontario, Shelley Spence, shares her latest report on the province's spending, and she's found some stuff she finds rather concerning. Then, a look at Canada's relationship with our other southern neighbor, Mexico. That's ahead on the agenda. Once a year, Ontario's Auditor General takes a deep dive into several aspects of provincial spending. The highlight of this year's report, how the Ford government managed the situation on Toronto's waterfront. The verdict? Not great. Let's get into the details with Shelley Spence, who last week issued her first ever report as the province's newest Auditor General. Welcome to the job. Welcome to our studio.
Thank you for having me.
It's nice to meet you here. Okay, I think it's always good to start off with a reminder of what your job actually is. And let's start with this. You are hired by the legislature, not the premier. What's the difference?
Oh, it's a big difference. I'm hired by, first of all, I interviewed with a subcommittee of the Public Accounts Committee, and then they bring forward their recommendation to the full Legislative Assembly, and then it is brought forward by the Speaker for a vote, and they vote on making me the Auditor General.
Do you know how many votes you got?
Unanimous.
You were unanimous?
Yes, I was.
I guarantee you are the only thing they've all agreed on then in the last 6 years or so. Okay, you've got a 10-year term, right?
Yes.
Which means theoretically you can criticize the government without fear that you're going to be fired. Is that right?
Yes, it is. Under my act, I can be let go, but it takes quite a majority to be able to do that. And really, as an independent officer, it's very important that you don't feel that pressure that, you know, if you criticize the government, that you're perhaps going to lose your job. So it helps with the independence, and it is similar for other officers of the legislature as well. We're appointed for a term, and in my case, it's non-renewable. And it is 10 years, which is a very long time, which I'm excited about because there's a lot we can do in 10 years.
There is another sort of spending watchdog at Queen's Park called the Financial Accountability Office. And they can respond to MPPs who request that they undertake investigations. Do you do that too? Do you respond to MPPs who want you to look into things?
So no, we're not obligated to do that under my act. We are obligated if, or we can be asked by a minister or the Public Accounts Committee to do a special audit. It's still up to my office to decide whether we can take that on. I would generally say if I was asked, I would definitely do the work, but we are not there to do the work if any MPP asks us.
Okay, so you undertake investigations, your office does, and you, in your wisdom, decided that there was something worth investigating at Ontario Place. Why did you decide to look into that?
So I just want to coin that it is called a performance audit. We're not investigators. So we audit, and we audit against criteria. We take a look at what we would expect to see with a major development project such as that. What are best practices? And we measure what happened against that.
And what did you find?
Well, we found that during the call for development process, they had some costs for site servicing, about $400 million that they thought they were going to spend. And the government had been saying that, you know, this isn't going to cost taxpayers money. They went through the call for development process where they had some bidders that were going to bid on doing the whole project, the whole island, and others that were just site-specific, so like multi-tenants in different spots. And they chose to go in that direction. And what we found is that when they made that decision, which is the government's decision, and that's fair, they didn't have the information on the fact that they would be on the hook for the public realm costs and other costs that perhaps a master developer that would do the whole island would take on themselves.
How did they not know that?
I'm not sure. I think they didn't know what those costs would be. They hadn't designed it yet, that kind of thing. So our recommendation is they need to look at implications of decisions. So we might not know the dollars exactly, but we know we're going to be spending dollars.
I don't say this to be a smart aleck. I just say it because I think it's a fact. The current Premier of Ontario tends to like to do business in a rather spontaneous, non-bureaucratic, let's make a deal kind of way. He's a former businessman and he likes his business experience when he brings that to bear in making decisions. When you are the Premier of the province of Ontario, is it okay to approach business that way?
So I'm not the Premier of the province of Ontario. I'm the auditor. And as an auditor, I like to look at what processes and policies are in place, what good practices are when you're making a decision like the redevelopment of Ontario Place. So we look for those checks and balances because they do help you make really good decisions. And they also help with transparency, accountability, and fairness. So that's what we looked at when we looked at Ontario Place.
But I think this Premier would argue, if I followed every bureaucratic process that I'm supposed to follow, I wouldn't have the dynamic, innovative result that he believes we will see when this thing is all said and done. We won't have these exciting new opportunities for the waterfront. I think that would be his position. Is he right to take that position?
So once again, I'm not the Premier, and I'm going to say that is, as an elected official of the province, that's their prerogative. But what we look at is what makes a good decision around, or not decision, but what is the information that the politicians need to make a decision. And we found that some of this information is lacking. And we made recommendations that in the future, they perhaps follow a different process than the call for development, like a request for qualifications or a request for information, so they get those big ideas that they want and get global, input into the process, but then still make a decision and then back up and do a request for proposal process that has a lot of checks and balances in place to make sure it's fair, open, and transparent.
I really am not trying to put words in your mouth here, but I really am trying to understand. You think a better outcome happens when politicians follow accountable and transparent processes, which, if I hear you right, were not followed in this case. Have I got that right?
So I wouldn't say politicians, I'd say the government. So we try and work with the bureaucracy of the government, so the deputy minister and down levels, to provide recommendations to help them do their jobs as well as they can. So our report, not just Ontario Place, but all of them are full of great recommendations that have been accepted by the most part by ministry staff. And they're going to work on those recommendations and implement them to make things better.
Do you really believe that?
I do.
You think they're going to take your recommendations and actually implement them? Because they haven't yet.
Well,
they haven't so far.
Well, we just, reported these recommendations, so we'll come back in 2 years and see how they're doing. And I do know that there's still phase 2 to go on Ontario Place. So if they, look at those recommendations and bring in those best practices, then I think that they'll do a good job.
You looked into the Science Centre situation as well.
Yes.
What did you find about the potential move of the Science Centre from Don Mills down to the waterfront?
So our office last year did a report on the Science Centre on the business case, basically, to either renovate the old centre or to move to the new centre. And that report at that time had, a cost benefit analysis done, et cetera, and the conclusion and decision of the government at that time was to move. And so fast forward to now, we know that the cost of the Science Centre to move it have gone up $400 million. And some of that includes some scope change, which means they made decisions after the fact to put in some ramps for school buses, et cetera, but also that costs for construction do escalate over time. So we also realized that the renovation of the old Science Centre, the cost would have also gone up. We don't have that analysis, so we couldn't really compare it in today's dollars.
But you did conclude that it wouldn't be $400 million.
We didn't look at the renovation costs again, because the government had not done that analysis yet.
But can we say it would have been cheaper if they just stayed where they were as opposed to trying to move things down to the waterfront?
What I can say is that, in the last case, it was pretty even. In this case, there is some more scope in the new Science Centre than what they had when they were first making that decision.
I'm going to ask this very carefully here. Should we question whether the government has been honest with us about the costs of putting a new Science Centre on the waterfront?
So that's a good question. We do look at the analysis, and we looked at those costs, and they are the experts at the Ministry of Infrastructure and Infrastructure Ontario that put together these cost estimates. So we look at them, and they are constantly updating them and making sure that they have the latest and greatest of the costs, and they do a good job at keeping track of those costs.
Did you examine whether the old site could still have been viable had they wanted it to be?
So that was our report last year. And definitely we said, the cost, if you take a look at the costs of the two different options, they're very close. And then the government made the decision to move.
Because again, I ask you that question because the government's position has been, we have to move to the waterfront because the old site was completely unviable, would have required a fortune going into it in order to keep it up to standards, and therefore we needed to move to the waterfront. It sounds like what you're telling me is that's not quite accurate. Can I say that?
So the government themselves released the business case around this, and when you look at the costs, they were a little less expensive to move, but not remarkably less expensive.
Not remarkably. Okay, let's go on and talk about another thing that you looked into, not investigated, but what do you say? What's the word?
Performance audit.
A performance audit?
Or audited.
You did an audit on this. Mm-hmm. Government advertising. You can't watch a hockey game, an NFL game. You can't watch anything these days, certainly sports on TV, without seeing a commercial for the province of Ontario. When you looked into those ads, what did you find?
Well, overall, it's under my act again that we report on government advertising. And it's under the Government Advertising Act that we report on the advertising of the government to make sure that it is following the rules of the Act. And the Act had been changed in 2015 by a former government. And at that time, a lot of the things that we were looking for in the ads were taken away. So we can look at an ad and say it's partisan if there's a member of the political party there, if it has the colors of the political party, and a few other things. And that's about it. So when we are asked to pass these ads to be aired, for the most part, most of them get through. And what we did in our report, we noticed they spent $103.5 million this year, which is the highest ever. And of that, about 62% of the ads would not have passed the former act and the rules that were in that.
But that's the former act.
Yes.
So they do pass the current act.
Yes, they do.
Now, the former act, I think it was the previous Kathleen Wynne government that changed the rules because they thought that the rules were too strict. And I think I can remember that the Auditor General of the day back then went to the Wynne government and said, you've got a red apple in that ad. Red means liberal, therefore that's too partisan. Would you agree that that was a bit too persnickety?
That's folklore from what I know. I don't know if that truly happened. I think there were reasons on both sides as to why, they weren't necessarily in agreement. And so the rules, all I know is that the rules were more lax after that. Mm-hmm. But I've heard that rumor myself, but I don't know if it's true. It could be folklore.
Deb Matthews bringing it up on the floor of the legislature. I don't know how many years ago. It's probably 10 years ago now. But yeah, she insisted that the auditor gave them HE double hockey sticks for putting a red apple in the ad.
I'm not going to comment on the
Okay.
past. I think that there was a desire at the time for the government to produce certain ads that may not have passed the act. So the act was more lax after that.
How granular do you get when you look at these ads to determine whether or not they pass muster?
We do have an entire group in my office that does this work, and then it's approved through my deputy or myself. And so we do have a worksheet. We get very granular. We look at everything.
Like what?
So we'll look at whether it's website material or if it's print media, watch those radio, those TV ads, radio, etc. And we look at it and we mark it against the criteria of the Act. And then our team also marks it against the criteria of the old Act so that we understand which ones wouldn't have passed in the old Act.
And it's your view that 6 out of 10 ads would not have passed under the old rules?
Or 62% of the costs of the ads.
Of the costs?
Yes.
Gotcha. Which seems to me, it sounds to my ears like you're saying these ads were, in some cases, too partisan. Is that right?
The definition of the ad under the old Act would have said Does it have information for people of Ontario? Is it informative? Is it educational? Is it providing information that the people need to know? And, you know, if we both know that we live in Ontario, that isn't really providing me with information about goods and services.
Okay, so free flu shots are available at your local pharmacy is reasonable information for a government to convey. Free flu shots from your local pharmacy, courtesy of the munificence of the current government of Ontario led by Doug Ford, that's not okay.
That's not okay under both acts, actually. You wouldn't be able to mention the Premier's name.
Do you have any recommendations as it relates to whether we need stricter regulations in place on governments, regardless of stripe, going forward?
I do. We recommend 2 recommendations every year, actually, in our report. One is to bring back the definition of partisan from the old act. And the other recommendation is to allow us to review social media advertising.
Ooh.
Because it's not under either of the old act or the new. It just isn't covered by the act.
You really want to get into social media? That's the Wild West, you know. I mean, it's just a complete toxic lake of you-know-what.
Well, most social media is, but when the government is paying for to advertise on social media, they have no restrictions on what they can say. So we've seen them ourselves. Citizens know what I'm talking about. So that isn't covered under the act. So it can have the name of a person in a political party. It can have political party colors, etc. It's not covered under the act. So we do not review those ads.
So you've made the recommendation to the current government that you think you should have some jurisdiction to look at social media ads and potentially toughening up the regulations of regular conventional advertising as well. Have you heard back from them as to whether they will accept those recommendations?
So to start with, it's kind of rare for our office to ask for legislation changes, but this was about what we did and what we want to do in order to make sure that we were getting value for money as taxpayers out of those ads. So that's why we're making those recommendations. Now, the government is not going to take on those recommendations at this time.
Have they told you that?
Yes, it's in our report.
They've said directly, we're not interested right now.
Yes.
For forever or for now?
Currently. I don't have the quote, but if you look in our report, there's a response from the government, and it basically says that we're not considering this at this time.
In fairness to them, they're under no obligation to accept your recommendations on anything, are they?
They're not. That's true.
And they can ignore your recommendations at their political peril, if you like, right? If they think they got a better story to tell than what you're telling, then they're free to thumb their noses at you, aren't they?
So when we clear our reports with the auditees, we have a lot of back and forth and discussions with them about our recommendations. And because we really want recommendations that they can do, that are practical for them to complete, that will really move the bar on the services that we're talking about for people of Ontario. So I take the recommendations very seriously in the fact that, we're not going to recommend something that isn't going to help or isn't going to be done. So we talk to them, we work with them on the recommendations, and then they provide the response. And usually the response is that they agree. They agree with our recommendation, and they'll sometimes detail some of the implementation they've already started doing. And then we come back in 2 years' time to see how they're doing with their implementation. We come back again at 5 years to see how they're doing, and we publicly report that. So they know that we're going to come back and keep on these and keep asking and telling the public whether or not they've done anything about the recommendations. We also have the Public Accounts Committee who does hearings based on our reports and holds the government to account for that at the time by coming to committee and saying, how are you doing with these recommendations? Are you implementing them? How are you doing? Where are you?
You got any sense about what percentage of recommendations made by your office are actually adhered to by the respective ministries that you audit?
So not overall, but for our 5-year follow-up, for example, 42% of our recommendations from 5 years ago were fully implemented, which isn't...
That's not great.
It's not great.
No.
So, we wanted to actually spend the time looking at why. And we did look into why, and there's some discussion of that in our report. If you look at the 5-year follow-up report, sometimes there's been a change in the program completely. So that's understandable. Sometimes it's two parties need to work together, and that's taking a little bit more to do, like two different ministries, for example, or an agency and a ministry. So there's lots of that. And we're looking at that and looking at making recommendations in the future audits to again work with the audit team and make sure that everybody's in agreement that this is going to move the bar and we're making things better in these programs for people of Ontario.
Okay. I got a minute left here, and I just want to ask you, because this is your first one. Mm-hmm. How easy or hard was it to get information out of the various ministries that you felt you needed to do your job?
So the nice thing about my office is that we do have great access to information, and our auditees are very cooperative. Sometimes it takes a little time to dig up the data we're asking for, or figure out, back and forth, what do you need and what do we have. So I would say overall they're very cooperative.
I'm imagining a situation where you went in there and demanded some information, and somebody in some ministry said, "Mind your own business, Shelley," and you said, "This is my damn business." Did that happen?
No, that did not happen.
Oh, damn, that would have been so dramatic.
They already know that they have to give me the information, so that doesn't happen.
Okay, gotcha. Well, this may be the first of who knows how many visits you make here at TVO, but we're happy to meet you this first time. And we thank you, Shelley Spence, the Auditor General of Ontario, for spending some time with us here at TVO tonight.
And thank you for having me and shining a light on our work.
Not at all. Canada-Mexico relations hit a rough patch earlier this year following the Canadian ambassador's criticism of Mexico's judicial reforms. Hopes for a rapprochement were raised following the election of Mexico's first female president, Claudia Sheinbaum. Those hopes, however, were dashed when Donald Trump announced his intention to impose a 25% tariff on all products coming from Mexico and Canada, leading to strong reactions in both countries. Will Trump's threat strain 85 years of Canadian-Mexican relations? For more on this, we're joined by, in Mexico City, José Luis Granados Sella, a journalist and co-host of the Soberania Mexican Politics podcast. And with us here in studio, Solange Marquez Espinoza, geopolitical analyst and co-author of Mexico and Canada, Two Nations in a North American Partnership. And Laura MacDonald. She is the Chancellor's Professor of Political Science at Carleton University. And we are delighted to welcome you two here in our studio. José Luis in Mexico City, great to have you on the line as well. And I want to start with you because, as we suggested in the intro, Canada and Mexico have had pretty good relations for going on more than 80 years now, until August, when the former Mexican president, López Obrador, halted relations between our two countries. Give us the background. What happened there?
Sure, absolutely. So I think the first thing that we have to keep in mind when we're thinking about this recent differences that have existed between Mexico and Canada as of late, that one of the key pillars of the political process known here domestically as the Fourth Transformation of Mexico, which started in 2018 with the election of López Obrador, is the defense of sovereignty. The defense of sovereignty has always been really, really important to Mexicans in general. Having the United States as a neighbor makes it kind of natural that that would be the case. And so very jealously, the Mexican population and the Mexican government guards that. And so these comments made by the U.S. ambassador and the Canadian ambassador did not rub the government well. They were very offended that these comments were perceived as interference in Mexican sovereignty, interference in the domestic affairs. This judicial reform was one of the major issues in the election. This was something that was very important for the ruling Morena party, which was reelected in the last election here over the summer. And obviously with Claudia Sheinbaum, it's very much a continuity of these kinds of priorities for the Mexican government, the defense of sovereignties, which is basically to say Mexico is going to pursue its own path. I think if we had to define the Fourth Transformation, as it's called here, it would be a post-neoliberal period. And so this reform was very much in line with that priority of the government to try to imagine a different kind of political economy for Mexico. And so that's why we saw López Obrador mention this pause. But really right now, as you well mentioned, the test now is what's going to happen with Donald Trump, because unfortunately,
well, hold off on that. Hold off.
We're
We're not ready to get to Donald yet. We need a little more background in place first.
Sure.
So Solange, let me go to you on that. Mexico made history. Claudia Sheinbaum, first female president. Is the expectation under her leadership that she will continue the approach and the patterns of her predecessor, or is this a chance for a new chapter in Mexican-Canadian relations?
Well, what I have seen in the first months of Claudia Sheinbaum as president is a continuity. She, in fact, started her campaign telling the people that she wanted the continuation of the fourth transformation, which is the movement Andrés Manuel López Obrador started in Mexico in 2018. So she's a continuation. She's looking for a continuation inside and in foreign affairs. So we will see a similar approach in the Mexico-Canada relationship and a similar approach to the Mexico-US relationship. We will see some changes, and we will talk later about those changes, especially with the US relationship. But as for Canada, as we have seen in the first months, as I said, we will see similar approach continuation of the polity.
Let me show everybody a picture. Here is the Prime Minister of Canada along with the new President of Mexico. They are shaking hands. They are both smiling. This is at the G20 in Brazil last month. Laura, did they patch things up?
Well, I think they had a friendly conversation, and that's all to the good. That's what we need in this moment, is a little bit stepping down, I think, from some of the rhetoric that accompanied the surprise announcement of the 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada. And so they had a friendly discussion. I think Sheinbaum tried to clarify some matters with Trudeau. I think he was kind of following the rhetoric of the provincial premiers, thinking that this is a disaster, these tariffs, and we have to gang up on Mexico. So I think she clarified that Mexico is not currently exporting Chinese-made vehicles to the United States or anywhere else. It has trade with China, as other countries do, but it's not exporting those vehicles. And I think she expressed a little bit of preoccupation about some of the rhetoric that was being thrown around, especially by Doug Ford. He made comments something like, "This is the most insulting thing I've ever heard, that Trump should mention Mexico and Canada in the same breath, that we have the same problems," which is, a very hurtful thing to say to Mexico, that you can't even compare the two countries because we're so much better than Mexico. So well, I think she was trying to clarify that.
I'm not sure
situation.
He said we're better than Mexico.
No, but that was the implication.
Well, he thinks he has a special relationship with the United States because he's had an office in Chicago, obviously, with his family business.
Yeah.
And he described Trump's comments, and I guess, Jose Luis, I'll go back to you on this. He described Trump's comments about 25% tariffs on Canada, which obviously includes Ontario, as a dagger to the heart. So that's the Ontario Premier, but I want to get your view on how the President of Mexico responded when she learned about this threat for 25% tariffs from the United States.
Yeah, it's actually been really interesting to see the two reactions, one from Mexico and from Canada. And in the case of Mexico, what Claudia said was a strongly worded letter, basically outlining her position, saying here's why I think your position is incorrect. Here's why we've actually done a lot to control the movement of migrants and drugs into the United States from Mexico. I think you've made some mistakes here, but also said if you try to impose these kinds of tariffs on Mexico, then there will be reciprocity. There will be tariffs in kind. And it looks like that letter worked well. There were some warnings there that will the infamously sexist Trump respond well to a woman criticizing him? Well, it looks like it played out well. And obviously we have the case of Canada as well, which went through a different route to fly down to Mar-a-Lago and meet in person. And if you were to ask me, my perspective, I think the Mexico strategy so far is working out well for Mexico in the sense that this kind of moved on the conversation. Once again, it was asked at today's morning press conference, and she said, we want to work with this government. We're going to work with his transition team. We want to resolve these issues because ultimately, if we actually do go down this path, we're going to destroy this economic union that we have in North America. And that's not going to serve any country, neither Canada, United States, or Mexico.
Solange, you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I understand what Jose Luis is trying to explain, but however, I must disagree on the strategy of Mexico is working. Unfortunately, I don't think that it is working. We have seen this, and we will see these threats from Trump coming administration. He is not even president and is starting to set the stage for what is coming in the coming years. So what we saw in the first stage is that this threat of 25% tariff. Mexico responded with this letter, and now we saw a couple of days ago another threat telling that Mexico and Canada should become states of the United States, part of the United States. So it is not it is not working. I cannot say that Canadian strategy is working either, because Justin Trudeau presented at Mar-a-Lago personally face-to-face meeting, and he didn't have even a pardon or a retreat on the argument of the 25% tariff. Mexico presented a letter, and we haven't seen any changes. What we have seen is an argument from the Mexico in two ways, and I think Mexico's strategy is kind of bipolar, because in one way we presented a letter, very strong letter, but it is for domestic issues. It is domestic policy. And in other way, you can see Claudia Sheinbaum declarations about taking migrants into Mexico, helping them in Mexico, starting to open the doors for them. So what you have you are saying is two different messages: one for domestic policy, and the other one for Trump administration, coming administration, saying, well, maybe we can talk about migration issues later.
You want to weigh in on that?
Well, I just think we should remember that Mexico already did a lot to address Trump's concerns under the first Trump administration. I mean, they adopted this policy of remain in Mexico, where the migrants had to stay in Mexico. And also they have a policy of shipping the migrants regularly down to the southern border. They're assuming enormous costs and problems keeping migrants in Mexico. So they've already done a lot. I think they could do more on drug trafficking, as could the U.S. on weapons smuggling. Like, there's more we can all do to address these issues, but it's not like neither Mexico nor Canada has done anything in the past, and certainly we had to very much face these issues under the first Trump administration.
I want to circle back to the reaction that came in, particularly from two premiers. We talked about Doug Ford of Ontario already, but Danielle Smith in Alberta also put forward the notion that perhaps Canada ought to look to cutting out Mexico from a continent-wide agreement. And well, obviously this elicited some strong responses. And here's Andrew Coyne, the columnist in the Globe and Mail, writing about this. Sheldon, put this up if you would, and here's what he had to say. This is a truly terrible idea, meaning cutting Mexico out. Bilateralizing a trilateral deal means the U.S. becomes the hub and Canada and Mexico the spokes. The only way to have guaranteed access to all three markets is then to locate your plant in the U.S. More than that, it allows the U.S. to play us off against each other. I understand the temptation to panic and throw Mexico to the Trumpian wolves, hoping we will be spared, but it is in our national interest to work together with other countries in containing him, not to cut sly little side deals. Okay, let me hear all of you on that. Jose Luis, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I think it very much is driven by panic. There is this sense amongst Canadian politicians that if we throw Mexico under the bus, maybe we'll be okay. But it's worth remembering that in the previous round of negotiations, when NAFTA was being renegotiated, actually Trump wanted to kick Canada out. And it was thanks to the insistence of Mexico that it maintained a tripartite deal. And so it's important to remember that this needs to be a united bloc. I saw a press conference with Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, and they asked her directly, you have concerns about Mexico being a backdoor. This is what we keep hearing. Do you have any evidence of that? And unfortunately, she wasn't able to produce any. And so I think a lot of this is actually being driven is one by panic and the other of this rivalry with China. And if that's the case, if that's what politicians are are paying attention to, then it actually makes way more sense to maintain a three-country agreement, because as an economic union, you can actually compete. Mexico on its own, Canada on its own is not going to be able to. And so I think much of this is actually driven, oddly enough, by the situation of this rivalry with the United States with China, so much so that actually Mexico became the U.S.'s #1 trade partner as a result of the shifting dynamics in international trade. It's no longer China, it's not Canada, it's actually Mexico. So kicking Mexico out doesn't really seem to be on the agenda for me anyway.
Solange, when you heard the two premiers say, let's kick Mexico out and just have a bilateral agreement with the U.S., how did you react?
Yeah, I think it is very unfortunate. And I think it is, fortunately, it is domestic policy for them too. Mexico and Canada have a very strong relation in terms of trade. But most importantly, together they present a very strong negotiation point in front of the U.S. Because otherwise, what happened in 2019 when we started to renegotiate NAFTA and became the CUSMA or USMCA, Mexico and Canada staying together present a very much more stronger position. Otherwise, it will be very hard for Mexico or for Canada to get some of their important points presented in front of the U.S. And they are going to twitch their arms and force them to agree on some things that otherwise they might disagree with. So I think it is important to understand what is happening in Canadian politics too. And otherwise, it's going to be a very complicated time for the renegotiation in 2026.
Laura, I have heard on the QT from national officials that they didn't mind when the Premier of Ontario and the Premier of Alberta were suggesting that Mexico might get kicked to the curb and we ought to do that. Mm-hmm. They didn't mind the provincial premiers making that point. Lloyd Axworthy was on this program, the former foreign minister, a couple of weeks ago, and he said, that's a dumb idea. If you don't want to be in a one-on-one relationship with the United States, where do you come down on it?
No, I agree with Mr. Axworthy. I think this is exactly where Trump wants us. That's his instinct, is to divide and conquer, to try to bully his opponents or partners by dividing us, and he thinks he can get a better deal bilaterally. So the last thing we should do, in my opinion, is to jump on that idea of kicking out Mexico. I don't see where it gets us anywhere. But I just wanted to look back historically a little bit and say that this is the tendency of many Canadian elites and Canadian leaders, is to think that we're the best friends of the Americans and we can get a much better deal from them than the Mexicans can, because we know Mexicans are stigmatized in the United States. So even when we first got our free trade deal with the United States and then it was decided to bring in Mexico, Canada didn't want to do that. They didn't want to have a trilateral deal to start with. They were just kind of forced into that because that was the way it was going.
Special status.
We thought we'd lose our special status, but this is just the way the world economy is going, is the formation of regional trade blocs. And we have to accept that tendency and not think that we do have this like cozy special relationship with the United States, because, you know, Trump doesn't work that way. It's all transactional.
Jose Luis, now that our two countries, Canada and Mexico, have had this kind of, well, let's call it a bit of a fraught relationship over the last little while, do you think, particularly now with Donald Trump coming in on the 20th of January, that it has forced us to really re-examine our relationship, having some especially tough conversations with one another? What do you think?
I think the more that we come together, the better. It's been, I lived many years in Canada and was very active in the political scene there. But we talked so little about Mexico, even in political circles when I was living there. So the more that we talk about Mexico and the Canada-Mexico relationship, and not always relating it to the United States, I actually think can be a really positive thing, so that people understand the benefits of investing. You know, Mexico obviously has gone through a very difficult period, especially around drugs and organized crime groups and things like that. But there's also, I think, people who come here see that Mexico is a country that is optimistic, that feels good. I mean, the government has sky-high approval ratings. And so if Canadians can have that closeness to Mexico. I think we can not only come together economically as we have since the signing of the free trade agreement, but also culturally, politically, learn from each other's experiences. I think there's a lot of things happening in Mexico that I think Canadians would be really excited to learn about what's happening. As a quick aside, I had some friends who came to visit, and they were blown away at all of the investments in public infrastructure, affordable transit, all the kinds of things that we want to see happening throughout the world. I'm sure there's many Canadians who want to see it actually happening here in Mexico, and I think in that sense, it would be good for us to have more conversations with each other.
Jose Luis, just out of curiosity, we're about, 100 meters south of an LRT, a light rail train line that was supposed to have been opened 4 years ago at a cost of about half of what it is right now. Does that kind of thing happen in Mexico City as well?
No, actually, we've had all to the contrary. We've seen 3 new cable car kind of setups, gondolas built to service poor areas. In the south of the country, the Tren Maya was built. So in the period that López Obrador was elected, was in office, and left, all of that, the LRT still hasn't opened, right? So we've seen that its investment in public infrastructure has actually been quite a big payoff, and that helps explain why we do have high approval ratings for the government here.
Could you please send Metrolinx's phone number to the people who are building the LRTs down there and maybe get the two? No, never mind. But it would be nice to get this one open eventually. Let me ask you this, Solange. There's a lot of America First in the air right now, right? Donald Trump has been running successfully on an America First platform. Some people think maybe Canada and Mexico should run on a Canada First platform, or Mexico ought to run on a Mexico First platform. Where do you think that would get us?
Well, may I just jump in what something that Jose said? Sorry about that, but I must disagree again. Unfortunately, I don't think Canada should copy the way Mexico has been doing infrastructure. Unfortunately, Maya train has had a lot of troubles, not just corruption, but also with environmental issues. A lot of things have been doing in a very bad way. Very quickly, yes, I have to agree with that. Unfortunately, not in a good way. Tren Maya has been created a very huge damage.
What does that mean, incidentally? Train Maya?
Maya train is the region.
Okay.
The Mayas used to live there, so they created this in a very fragile ecosystem. So unfortunately, it has created a problem, an environmental problem that will last for decades, and it might be irreversible.
Okay. One thing I did not think that we do in this discussion is get into transportation policy.
Yeah,
so
no.
We're going to get us out of that now.
Just to say that.
Just as an aside.
Just to say
okay.
that.
So
yeah.
let's talk about Canada first, Mexico first, U.S. first. What happens if we all pursue our own self-interest to the exclusion of everyone else?
Unfortunately, I think it will be very much trouble, because if we started to talk about just Mexico, just Canada, just the U.S., it is going to be a narrative. It is a populist narrative in the 3 cases that might get them higher approval ratings in domestic policy, but unfortunately it will create a lot of tension in the renegotiation of the agreement, of the trilateral agreement. What we need is to start thinking again in a North American region. We need that in order to confront China. If we want really to have a policy that can confront China and other actors, important actors in trading in the world, we need to think about the region. And North America is a very important region in the world. It is one of the most important regions, trade regions in the world. So if we break that out, it is going to be the worst thing for our own country.
Well, except that Donald Trump thinks of America first. He campaigned on America first. He won on America first. How do you get the leader of the United States, who's an America firster, to start thinking continentally?
I mean, I think what the Trudeau government did last time around with the first administration was basically the only recourse we have, which is to rally allies in the United States, like mayors and governors and the private sector and unions, and convey to them the message that they will lose jobs in the United States if they pursue these America First policies and don't think about the essential ties, the value chains that have been constructed over decades between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. That's not good for the United States, let alone kicking out, 11 million migrants will destroy the U.S. economy. So I think that's the only choice we have, is to appeal to people in the United States who recognize that we have things in common, and they need to be pushing Trump. Where, us pushing Trump on our own is not going to be very effective.
Jose Luis, your take on everybody out for themselves and what the consequences could be?
I think if that happens, unfortunately, Canada's probably the most vulnerable country. Mexico has pursued a diversified strategy, has reached out to different parts of the world. It's investing in ports to serve the Pacific. So even if let's call it the worst case scenario, right? Everybody kind of goes on their own, everybody pursuing their own personal interests. One of the things that I've said is that Mexico has options, right? It's been investing in its relationships with Latin America. It rescued the community of Latin American and Caribbean states from irrelevance. It's, like I said, it's building a massive expansion of the Manzanillo port. And so I think Mexico would be able to find other trade partners. Obviously, there would be a lot of impact as well. I'm not trying to pretend like it wouldn't have consequences, but I do think that Canada is far more restrained in that sense, of an inability to be able to diversify. Obviously, we know that there are strained relations between Canada and China, for example. So if it starts to become this, regional global rivalry, I think Mexico over the long term would be okay, but still, we have many decades now of working together. We should continue to do that because it has been beneficial for all three countries, despite Trump's rhetoric about the trade deficits within the other countries, right? The U.S. benefits from this deal as well. And so I don't think that I think what the other panelists said here about making sure that they understand the consequences of pursuing this strategy is probably the smartest move, so that they don't actually go down this path, because it could be pretty catastrophic for all three.
Solange, let me put this to you as the person who wrote the book about Mexico and Canada and that relationship. We in this country, I think it's fair to say, have always been so desperate to be America's best friend. 77% of our trading is with them. Canadians like going to the United States. We like it when Americans come up and spend their more valuable dollars up here. Do you think we have been so focused on the United States and our relationship with them to the exclusion and detriment of our potential relationship with Mexico?
Absolutely. There are a lot of spaces that are not taking, Canada is not taking the possibilities that are in Mexico. Not just as a trade partner, but also in education and tourism. There are many other areas that we are not collaborating together, because when you see, and it is the same in Mexico, Canada sees Mexico as very far away and as a place for having vacations, as beach and sun, and mostly that is the idea for Canadians about Mexico. And in the case of Mexico, it's similar. When we wrote this book, we started to have some very interesting discussions between each other, Mexicans and Canadians. And the idea of the perspective to open up more channels of communications was very hard, even in universities, even between think tanks, because we see each other very far. And different in a different way, but we are very concentrated on have the attention of Washington. Mexico wants the attention of Washington, and Canada the same, but we don't look each other as allies for that attention either, or for any other different partnerships.
Laura, I wonder if part of it is, the United States obviously is right next door. Most of the people we do business with speak English. Mexico is further away. Tell me I'm wrong, but I don't think there are that many Canadians who speak Spanish. So it's a tougher nut to crack, isn't it?
For sure. And I think, for decades, Canadian business people have just felt it's so easy to go to the United States. They speak the same language, very similar culturally. So it's almost kind of a laziness thing that, in Europe, people learn different languages, and the same in Asia. So that, people are capable of learning new languages or have translators, and many Mexicans do speak English, so that helps. But it is a kind of mental barrier to get over the idea that you have to go to a different place that, might not be exactly like the society you're used to dealing with.
In which case, Jose Luis, you want to give some advice to either people watching or listening to this or policymakers in the nation's capital or the provincial capital. How do we get Mexico and Canada, and Ontario in particular, to be better friends?
I think certainly understanding how much we benefit each other, right? Not just a trade, but also culturally, socially. I know that during the pandemic, we saw here in Mexico City an influx of people from places like Toronto, Vancouver, that it became prohibitively expensive to live. So they came and became digital nomads here, and they fell in love with the city. The truth is that, yes, it is a different culture. It is very different in many ways, but there are many Mexicans here who speak English, certainly here in the capital, and people find that it is a very welcoming place. It's said to be amongst the friendliest places that you can visit. But I think in terms of policy, of paying attention to the Ottawa-Mexico City relationship, I think especially with the unpredictability of Washington, it does make more sense for us to be able to cooperate. I think that's been negatively impacted. You know, it was disappointing to see Trudeau kind of echo these comments about Mexico being a backdoor when there's no evidence as such. And I do think that, you know, given the happy pictures at the G20, there's room for that relationship to once again improve and to see each other and treat each other as equals. Often Mexico has been treated as lesser. We saw the comments from Doug Ford that, you know, taking offense at being compared to that. Of course, you know, we are equals. I mean, that's part of it. And I opened this conversation talking about the defense of sovereignty. That's why our political program is called Soberanía. That's the word for sovereignty in Spanish. We can have that kind of relationship, but always as equals.
Let me do a quick follow-up with you. What's the population of Mexico City right now?
The greater metropolitan area is close to 25 million people. It's a huge, huge place.
Okay, so it's like 1.5 provinces of Ontario, which means, I mean, I suspect there are lots of people up here who just think it's too big and too unwieldy and too difficult to get your hands around, which is why there isn't the relationship there might be. How do we get out of that way of thinking about Mexico City?
I think paying more attention to what is happening here. There is so many different other places to get information these days, right? Different news programs online, to actually have a sense that you have a familiarity with Mexico that perhaps you didn't or weren't able to get before. And again, I want to emphasize this, right? It's an exciting place to be right now. You know, there's a reason I'm living in Mexico City and not Toronto anymore. And I think this is a place where people can really kind of feel free. And, you know, we just happened to elect the first woman president of Mexico from a religious minority, right? So a lot of these culture war issues that I think are so predominant in North American politics, by that I mean the United States and Canada, aren't so much of an issue here. And I think people paying attention to the political scene here with criticisms, which I think are always welcome, would do well for everybody in the North American relationship.
Laura, I don't think the Liberals would like me saying this, but this is the reality when you're 20 points behind in the public opinion polling surveys, and that is that if the next election takes place next year, as everybody thinks it will, and if Pierre Poilievre wins for the Conservatives, as a lot of people think he will, his wife's not Mexican, but she is Latin American. And one wonders whether that changes the dynamic in the relationship among our two countries. What do you think?
The Poilievre election?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, his wife is Venezuelan, but she's from a right-wing Venezuelan background, so I wonder if she might be more critical of the AMLO tradition, the Sheinbaum tradition in Mexico, because she comes from that right-wing background. Poilievre himself, I believe he also supported the idea that we should just go it alone with the United States and kick Mexico under the bus. So I'm skeptical about what might happen under a Poilievre administration vis-a-vis North America and Mexico. But the fact, we haven't heard much from Poilievre about what he will actually do, as opposed to he will not be Trudeau. So if he is elected, he'll have to deal with these really serious issues. And I'm hoping he'll adopt a bit more mature attitude and view the real interests of Canada, which, as Solange and Jose Luis have been saying, lies in our collective future.
We got about 2 minutes left here, and Solange, let me put it to you. Regardless of what happens with the 25% tariffs and with the USMCA, U.S., Mexico, Canada trade agreement, NAFTA was going to come under renegotiation in 2026 anyway. What do you see?
Well, what I see right now is the interest of the three countries on the renegotiation, which is good. I have the hope that after Canada passed this electoral moment, they will start to think and to see the benefit of having the three countries in this agreement. And in the same page, I see Mexico starting to try to make changes in a very in a continuation of what they have before. But what I hope is that some of the people that is now that are now in the cabinet of Claudia Sheinbaum knows and understands the difficulties and challenges of this relationship, and they will understand that they might stay together. They should stay together with Canada in order to have a better trade agreement, in order to have these possibilities for all the people in the region. So I have hopes for the 2026 renegotiation of CUSMA, TEMEC, USMCA.
Whatever we want to call it. Those are your hopes. My hopes are that someday Jose Luis is going to find that he can move back to Toronto because the public transit system here is so good that he misses it so much that he's going to want to return. What do you think the odds on that happening are, Jose Luis?
I think they're low, but let's not rule it out.
Okay, good. That's Jose Luis Granado Sea. He's a journalist and co-host of the Soberania Mexican Politics podcast. We thank you for joining us from Mexico City. Solange Marquez Espinoza, the name of her book once again, Mexico and Canada, Two Nations in a North American Partnership. And Laura McDonald, the Chancellor's Professor of Political Science at Carleton University in our nation's capital. Really great to have all three of you on our program tonight. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias por la invitación.
Gracias.
Merci.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, December 10th, 2024. Tomorrow on the program, does the world face a fertility crisis? We'll explore that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. We are where you are. TVO's current affairs journalism is available across platforms across Ontario, on Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and more. Catch The Agenda, The Thread, On Poly, and other podcasts, docs, and video series on the device of your choice when you choose.